This is section 5 of chapter 7, and in this section we will discuss procedures for increasing external validity using simulations and field studies. All right, so we've been talking about the importance of controls in order to remove confounds from your study and increase the internal validity of that study. But we've also mentioned that this comes with certain trade-offs, because your findings that were collected in the contrived settings of a laboratory may not transfer very well to the real world. And after all, most psychologists care about human behavior in the real world as opposed to in the laboratory. Also, we talked about the fact that people who know that they are in an experiment may change their behavior. They may react to the knowledge of being in an experiment and behave in ways that are perhaps unusual or not representative of how they would typically behave. So with that in mind, let's discuss a few techniques for maximizing the realism of the experimental environment, and we'll discuss what are called simulations and field studies. All right, so the goal of simulation in research is to simulate certain key aspects of the real environment. So imagine a driving simulator or a flight simulator for training, or how people have begun using VR for all kinds of trainings and simulations of the real world. Or in the armed forces, some of the drills and exercises are designed to create simulations of combat. So the same idea has been applied to psychological research, where what you want to do is create a simulation of some real-world setting or scenario in the lab, and then you manipulate some variables, as you would, and see how people respond. So again, the idea is to create realism. And there are two kinds of realism. One is referred to as mundane realism, which refers to the superficial similarities between the lab and the environment that you wish to simulate. So if you want to make your lab look like a hospital, if you change some superficial characteristics to make it look more like a hospital, that would be an example of mundane realism. Now, this may not work very well unless you do a really phenomenal job, which is hard to do. But if you don't do a good job, people may think that it's kind of cheesy and silly and probably won't really affect them. Okay, so the other type of realism is called experimental realism. And this refers to the extent to which your participants in the study experience a psychological sense of immersion in this simulation that you've created. So for example, a haunted house will use mundane realism to create a sense of psychological immersion, trying to create moments in which people feel like they are in a real scenario and forget that this is all fake. Or people that use VR will talk about immersion, where you temporarily forget that you have a VR headset and you feel like this is the real world, and you respond as if you are responding to the real world. So a classic example of simulation being used in a psychology study is the infamous Stanford prison experiment, where, if you recall, and we talked about this in chapter 4, I believe, people were assigned different roles, the roles of prison guards or the roles of prisoners, to see how they would respond in these different roles. Now, to make this realistic, an actual prison was built in the basement. And people were given actual uniforms. And they were there for an extended period of time. And a lot of the emotions and processes associated with people being arrested and jailed were all played out. So here you have a simulation of a real world and assigned role-playing for the denizens of this artificial reality. And if you recall, this study had to be ended prematurely because it became a little bit too real. People began taking their roles a little too seriously. There were ethical concerns that arose. So this study demonstrated mundane realism, a location that mimicked visually an actual prison, and also experimental realism, where the participants became so immersed in the study and their roles that the study had to be discontinued for ethical concerns. And so here, of course, is an image of the guards searching the inmates prior to putting them in their cells. Okay, so that's simulation, simulating a natural environment in a laboratory setting. So another approach is the field study, where you actually conduct your experiment out there in the real world. So you still manipulate some variables, and you still collect data, you make observations, but now you're doing so beyond the laboratory in the natural setting. As opposed to trying to mimic the world in your laboratory, you go out into the world. So one famous example of this is various studies on what is called the bystander effect. So how do people respond in emergency situations? And so what the scientists did was they snuck away from their laboratories and they created fake emergency situations out in the real world, on the street corner, in the park. And then they would manipulate different variables. For example, the number of people present, and see how actual observers, actual bystanders, would respond to this situation. A situation that's been contrived but feels very realistic from the standpoint of a person just walking by. And finally, let's discuss some advantages and disadvantages of using simulation and field studies in psychology research. So the advantages. Well, one obvious advantage is increased realism. So these methods are more realistic. They place people in situations and environments that are more realistic, that either mimic the real world or are the real world in the case of field studies. And of course, this is done for the purpose of increasing external validity. Now the disadvantages. Well, one obvious disadvantage is reduced control. The more realistic the environment, the less control you're going to have over any number of potential confounds, which can compromise the internal validity of the study. So there's always this trade-off. And especially in field studies, which are a little too realistic, you don't have that much control. And so, for example, you can't assign participants to conditions, which can be a problem. And also in simulations, the willingness of a participant to go along with your simulation, with your artificial environment, can be a factor as well. Not everybody is going to go along with this environment that you've created. And also, anytime somebody is aware that they're being observed, as would be the case in simulation studies, this can change their behavior and ultimately impact the results that you collect.